You didn't just survive. You proved that skin color cannot prevent
January
people from reaching the
15th,
sky.
1944.
They were in line.
A secure telephone line crackles to life in the Führerbunker beneath Berlin. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring's voice trembles as he delivers news that will haunt Adolf Hitler for the remainder of the war. Mein Führer, the American escort fighters. The ones with red tails.
Before they touch the
They are Negroes.
they must touch the absolute
The silence
precision
that
of the
follows
sky.
lasts exactly 11 seconds.
Red tails
Then
to
Hitler's
Saddle.
fist slams
They don't
onto the
just
map
fly.
table,
They
sending
protect
chess
the
pieces
sky of
scattering
freedom.
across occupied Europe.
Behind
The
every
impossible
shot,
has happened.
there is life.
The inferior race is winning the war in the sky. March 22nd, 1941. Tuskegee, Alabama. The morning sun cuts through the pine trees surrounding Moton Field, casting long shadows across a patch of red dirt that will soon become sacred ground in American history.
You didn't just survive.
The air smells of engine oil,
You proved
fresh
that
cut
skin
lumber,
color cannot
and
prevent
something
people
else
from reaching the
possibility
sky.
mixed with defiance. Eleanor Roosevelt steps out of a dusty sedan, her white gloves already stained from the journey. She has come to see something her husband's generals insist cannot exist: Negro pilots. "Mrs. Roosevelt, please," an Army official whispers urgently. "The flight isn't necessary. We can show you the facilities from the ground." She ignores him, walking directly toward a young instructor named Charles Alfred Anderson, who stands beside a small Piper Cub trainer. "Chief Anderson," she says, extending her hand. "I understand you've been teaching these young men to fly. I'd like to see for myself what they can do." Anderson glances at the Army officials, their faces frozen in bureaucratic panic. "Ma'am, it would be my honor." 40 minutes later, when the Piper Cub touches down again, Eleanor Roosevelt's smile could power the entire airfield. She steps out, removes her gloves, and turns to the assembled press corps. "I've just had the most wonderful flight. These young men can certainly fly." The photograph of that moment, the First Lady shaking hands with a black flight instructor, will travel across America like a shockwave, but it will take 3 more years and an ocean of blood before the world truly understands what she witnessed that day. But let's step back. To understand how black pilots came to defend democracy in the skies over Europe, we must first understand the machinery of discrimination they had to dismantle just to reach the cockpit. In 1940, the United States Army Air Corps operated under a simple, ugly premise. African Americans lacked the intelligence, courage, and moral character required for combat aviation. This wasn't whispered prejudice. It was typed policy, filed in manila folders, stamped with official seals. A War Department document from September 1940 stated explicitly, "Negro pilots cannot be used in our present Air Corps units." The reasoning was dressed in the language of science: inferior reflexes, limited spatial reasoning, deficient judgment under pressure. It was pseudoscience wearing a uniform, and it had the weight of institutional authority. But pressure was building. Civil rights organizations, particularly the NAACP and the Black Press, led by newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier and Chicago Defender, launched what they called the Double V campaign: victory abroad against fascism, victory at home against racism. How they asked relentlessly, could America fight Hitler's theories of racial superiority while practicing its own? The answer came in the form of a compromise that satisfied no one but opened a crack in the door. On January 16, 1941, the War Department announced the formation of an experimental all-Negro pursuit squadron. The word experimental was deliberate. It implied this was a test that could be failed, a pilot program that could be terminated. The location chosen was equally calculated: Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, deep in the segregated South, far from major population centers, where this experiment could be quietly conducted and, if necessary, quietly forgotten. The man chosen to lead this experiment was Benjamin O. Davis Sr., who in October 1940 had become the first African-American general in the United States Army. His son, Benjamin O. Davis Jr., a 1936 West Point graduate who had endured 4 years of total silence from his white classmates, not a single cadet spoke to him outside of official duties, was selected to command the 99th Pursuit Squadron. The younger Davis understood exactly what was happening. "They're setting us up to fail," he told his father. "And when we do, they'll say they gave us a chance." "Then don't fail," his father replied. The Tuskegee Army Airfield was built from scratch on 1,600 acres of Alabama red clay. The first class of aviation cadets, 13 men who would become known as the Tuskegee 13, began training in July 1941. Their instructors were Chief Anderson and a handful of other experienced black civilian pilots, along with white Army Air Corps officers who had volunteered or been assigned to this unprecedented duty. The training was deliberately brutal. Every standard was raised. While white aviation cadets at other bases received 65 hours of primary training, Tuskegee cadets received 80. While the washout rate at white training bases hovered around 40%, Tuskegee's exceeded 60%. The message was clear: you must be twice as good to be considered half as equal. Captain Noel Parrish, a white Kentuckian appointed as director of training, watched his cadets endure this systematic cruelty with growing anger. One evening in his office, he confronted a visiting general who had suggested the high washout rate proved the experiment was failing. "Sir, these men are performing at or above the level of any cadets I've seen. The difference is that we're judging them by a standard that doesn't exist anywhere else. We're not testing their ability to fly, we're testing their ability to endure humiliation." The general's response was bureaucratic ice. "Captain, your job is to run the program as designed, not to question its methodology." But Parrish saw something the general didn't. In the faces of cadets like Benjamin Davis Jr., Lee Archer, Charles McGee, and a quiet Alabama farm boy named Robert Williams, he saw not just competence, but transcendence. These men flew with a precision born of necessity. They knew a minor mistake would be used to condemn an entire race. March 7, 1942, the first class graduated. 5 men received their silver pilot wings: Benjamin O. Davis Jr., George Spencer Roberts, Charles DeBow, Mac Ross, and Lemuel Custis. The ceremony was attended by 2,000 people, including reporters from the black press, who understood they were witnessing history, but the white press largely ignored it. The New York Times gave it 4 sentences on page 18. The 99th Pursuit Squadron spent the next year training while the Army debated what to do with them. Some generals wanted to deploy them to combat. Others argued for keeping them in the United States on coastal patrol, safe limited duty that would prove nothing. Meanwhile, in Europe, the war was consuming pilots at a terrifying rate. The 8th Air Force, conducting daylight bombing raids over Germany, was losing bombers faster than factories could replace them. B-17 flying fortresses were falling from the sky in flames their crews lost over hostile territory. The mathematics of war eventually overruled the politics of prejudice. America needed every pilot it could train. In April 1943, the 99th Fighter Squadron, redesignated from Pursuit to Fighter, deployed to North Africa, then to Sicily, and finally to the Italian mainland. They flew P-40 Warhawks, initially providing ground support and coastal patrol. Their combat record was solid, but not spectacular, which gave ammunition to those who wanted the experiment terminated. A white colonel submitted a report claiming the Negro pilots lacked aggressive spirit and recommended the squadron be withdrawn from combat. Colonel Davis, now commanding the 99th, flew back to Washington to testify before the War Department. In a hearing room thick with skepticism, he presented meticulous combat logs, mission reports, and a simple argument. "We have been given the most dangerous missions with the least recognition. We have flown interdiction raids that white squadrons refused. We have lost pilots and planes. But we have never lost our discipline, our courage, or our commitment to this fight. If that is not aggressive spirit, then I don't know what is." The report was shelved, but Davis knew they were still on probation. Real vindication would require an undeniable achievement. That achievement was coming, but it required a new aircraft and a new mission. In June 1944, The all-black 332nd Fighter Group, comprising the 99th, 100th, 301st, and 302nd Fighter Squadrons, received P-51 Mustangs, the finest escort fighter in the world. Long-range, fast and deadly, the Mustang could accompany bombers all the way to Berlin and back. And in a decision that would become legendary, the ground crews painted the tails of every Mustang bright red. The reasoning was tactical bomber crews needed to identify their escorts instantly in the chaos of aerial combat. But the effect was psychological warfare. Those red tails became a signature, a promise, and eventually a legend. Captain Robert Williams, the quiet Alabama farm boy, who had once been told he'd never amount to more than a sharecropper, stood beside his Mustang on June 9, 1944, running his hand along the red tail. His crew chief, Sergeant Marcus Johnson, was buffing the paint to a high gloss. "Sarge, why you making it so shiny?" Williams asked. "German's gonna see us coming from 10 miles away." Johnson looked up, his face serious. "Captain, I want every German pilot to see this red tail in his nightmares. I want them to know exactly who shot them down." Williams smiled. "Fair enough. Let's make sure we give them something to remember." 2 days later, on June 11, 1944, the Red Tails flew their first long-range bomber escort mission to Munich. Captain Wendell Pruitt and Lieutenant Gwyn Pearson each destroyed a German fighter. The bomber formation they protected lost 0 aircraft. It was the beginning of something unprecedented. By July, the reputation of the Red Tails was spreading through the 8th Air Force like wildfire. Bomber crews began requesting them specifically. "Give us the Red Tails" became a common phrase at mission briefings. Their tactics were different from other escort groups. Instead of ranging ahead looking for kills to boost their personal scores, the Red Tails stayed tight with the bombers, forming what they called a protective cocoon. It was disciplined, selfless flying. It saved lives. And it was driving someone on the other side of the war absolutely mad with rage. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler was receiving reports from the Luftwaffe that didn't match his understanding of reality. The inferior Negro pilots were outflying the cream of the German Air Force. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, initially dismissed the reports as confusion or exaggeration. But the reports kept coming more detailed, more disturbing. The Führer, who had built an empire on racial hierarchy, was facing an inconvenient truth. His theories were being disproven at 25,000 feet, one dogfight at a time. And soon, his response would reveal just how deeply this threatened everything he believed. The phone call came at 2:47 a.m. on January 16, 1944. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring was already awake in his Baroque mansion at Carenhall, surrounded by looted Renaissance paintings and morphine bottles, when his adjutant knocked. The man's face was pale. "What is it?" Göring demanded, his silk robe trailing behind him as he moved toward his private office. "Reports from Italy, sir. Multiple sources. The American escort fighters. The ones destroying our interceptors over the bomber formations." "Spit it out." "They're Negroes, Herr Reichsmarschall." Göring's hand froze on his brandy glass. For a full 10 seconds he said nothing. Then he poured himself a drink, drained it, and poured another. "You're telling me that Negro pilots, actual Negroes, are shooting down Luftwaffe aces?" "Yes, sir. The intelligence is confirmed. They fly P-51 Mustangs with distinctive red tails. The American bomber crews call them Red Tail Angels. They haven't lost a single bomber in 7 consecutive missions." Göring sat down heavily. His entire adult life had been built on a simple premise. Aryan superiority wasn't just ideology, it was observable fact. The Luftwaffe was supposed to be the physical manifestation of German excellence, and now this adjutant was telling him that the inferior race was making his elite pilots look like students. "Get me everything. Flight patterns, tactics, kill ratios. And Werner," he added, his voice dropping, "prepare a briefing for the Führer. He needs to hear this from me before the whispers reach him." But the whispers had already started. Across the Mediterranean, at Ramitelli Airfield in Italy, Captain Benjamin Davis, Jr., stood in the operations tent at 0530 hours, studying reconnaissance photos of Munich. His exec, Captain Robert Williams, entered with 2 cups of terrible coffee. "Brass is happy," Williams said. 7 missions, 0 losses. They're talking about extending our rotation. Davis didn't smile. "They're talking about it because they can't believe it. We're not exceeding expectations, Robert. We're demolishing their assumptions, and that makes them nervous. Let them be nervous. Our boys are proving something every time they come back with all their wingmen." Davis looked up. "That's exactly what worries me. The better we do, the more dangerous this becomes. Not from the Germans, from our own side. We're making people confront things they don't want to confront." He was right to worry, though, not for the reasons he imagined. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler sat in the map room of the Reich Chancellery, listening to Göring's briefing with an expression that made everyone in the room want to be somewhere else. The Reichsmarschall had brought charts, graphs, combat reports from returning Luftwaffe pilots. The data was undeniable. "These Negro pilots," Hitler said slowly, pronouncing each word like he was chewing glass, "are protecting American bomber formations more effectively than white American squadrons. The statistics suggest." "I asked a simple question, Hermann." Göring swallowed. "Yes, mein Führer." Hitler stood, his hands clasped behind his back. For a long moment, he stared at the map of Europe, at the pins marking Allied advances at the shrinking perimeter of the Reich. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, which everyone knew was more dangerous than his screaming. "This is not a military problem. This is an existential one. Everything we have built, everything we have taught the German people about racial hierarchy, about natural order, these pilots are making it look like a lie. Do you understand what that means?" Göring nodded slowly. "If the German people begin to doubt the fundamental truth of our ideology, we don't just lose battles. We lose everything. The coherence of the Reich itself depends on these truths being immutable." Hitler turned to face the room. "I want options. I want solutions. And I want silence." "Silence, mein Führer. No German newspaper, no radio broadcast, no official communication will mention the race of these pilots. As far as the German people are concerned, they're fighting regular American squadrons. The moment we acknowledge this aberration, we give it power." SS Obergruppenführer Ernst Kaltenbrunner, head of Reich Security, leaned forward. "And unofficially, mein Führer?" Hitler's eyes went cold. "Unofficially, we solve this problem the way we solve all problems that threaten the ideological integrity of the Reich. We make it disappear." What happened next would never appear in official records. The orders were verbal, transmitted through secure channels, classified above top secret. But the intent was clear. The Red Tails had to be neutralized, and if they couldn't be defeated in the air, they would be destroyed on the ground. Back at Ramitelli on February 3, 1944, Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson was performing routine maintenance on Captain Williams's P-51 when he noticed something wrong with the fuel line. The rubber seal looked corroded. Too corroded for a plane that had been serviced 2 days ago. "Lieutenant Archer," he called to the assistant crew chief, "take a look at this." Lee Archer, who would later become the only black ace of World War II, examined the fuel line carefully. His face hardened. "That's not wear and tear, Sarge. That's sabotage. Someone put acid on this seal." "Could be a German infiltrator." "Could be." Archer paused. "Could also be one of the white mechanics from the other squadrons. We're not exactly popular on this base." They reported it up the chain. An investigation was launched and quietly buried. No perpetrator was found. But the Red Tails started posting armed guards on their flight line 24 hours a day. 3 weeks later, the first pilot was killed. Lieutenant Jerome Harris was shot down over Austria on February 24th. His chute deployed successfully, and he was seen landing in a forested area. The Red Cross later confirmed he'd been captured by Wehrmacht ground troops and was being transported to a POW camp. He never arrived. His body was found in March by advancing American forces dumped in a ditch 15 miles from where he'd been captured. He'd been shot in the back of the head at close range. The Wehrmacht claimed partisans must have attacked the transport. But there were problems with that story. The transport vehicle showed no signs of an ambush. The guards who'd been escorting Harris were unharmed and had been reassigned before they could be questioned. And witnesses in a nearby village reported seeing SS officers in the area that day. When news reached Ramitelli, the pilots gathered in the mess hall in silence. Captain Williams stood at the front, his jaw tight. Jerry was one of us. He followed every protocol, flew every mission by the book, and they executed him. We don't know it was an execution, someone said quietly. Yes, we do. This was Davis entering from the back. We all know. The question is, what we do about it. We file a formal complaint through channels. Davis cut him off. Channels, our own army won't even let us drink at the same officers' club as white pilots. You think they're going to start a diplomatic incident over a Negro lieutenant's death? The room fell silent. So what do we do, sir? Williams asked. Davis looked at each of them. We keep flying. We keep protecting those bomber crews. We keep being so damn good that nobody can deny what we are. Because the only thing that terrifies them more than us being killed is us succeeding. But Davis understood something darker was happening. This wasn't just about one pilot. This was systematic, strategic. Someone was testing the boundaries of what they could get away with. In Berlin, Kaltenbrunner was receiving regular updates from Abwehr operatives embedded near Allied air bases in Italy. The reports were encouraging. One Negro pilot eliminated with no international outcry. The Americans were suppressing the story themselves, unwilling to admit that their experiment was making men targets. Expand operations, Kaltenbrunner ordered. Fuel contamination, mechanical sabotage, targeted elimination of captured pilots. But maintain plausible deniability. If we're caught, it's rogue elements, overzealous local commanders. The Führer cannot be connected to this. And if the Americans do file protests, they won't. They're more embarrassed by these pilots than we are threatened by them. They'll keep it quiet to preserve their own internal politics. It was a calculation that proved partially correct and partially catastrophic. On March 8, 1944, 3 P-51s at Ramitelli exploded during pre-flight checks. The maintenance logs had been falsified. The planes had been fueled with contaminated gasoline mixed with sugar and ground glass. 2 crew chiefs died in the fires. A third lost both hands. This time, the investigation couldn't be buried. OSS officers descended on the base, interrogated everyone, and discovered a network of sabotage that stretched back months. 2 Italian civilians working as mechanics were arrested. Under interrogation, they broke. They'd been recruited by German intelligence and paid in gold to sabotage Negro aircraft specifically. Not white squadrons, not bomber wings, just the red tails. The OSS report landed on General Eisenhower's desk with a thud. His chief of staff watched him read it, watched his face turn red, watched him throw it across the room. They're targeting them because they're Negroes. Yes, sir. And we're supposed to just... What, accept this? Tell these pilots, sorry you're good enough to die for your country, but we can't protect you from being murdered because of your skin color. Sir, if we make this public, the political ramifications... I don't give a damn about political ramifications, Eisenhower shouted. Then quieter. Get me the Secretary of War, and double the security at Ramitelli. If anyone else touches those planes, I want them shot on sight. But even as security increased, the Red Tails knew the truth. They were fighting 2 enemies. One wore swastikas and flew Messerschmitts. The other wore the same uniform they did, and whispered that they didn't belong in the sky. On March 24th, the Red Tails flew their first mission to Berlin. Captain Armour McDaniel led a flight of 4 Mustangs escorting a bomber formation through the heaviest flak corridor in Europe. When they reached the target area, 12 Luftwaffe fighters dove on them from above. What happened next entered legend. McDaniel's wingman, Lieutenant Charles Bailey, called out the attack. "Bandits, 6 o'clock high. Stay with the bombers." McDaniel ordered, his voice ice calm. "Do not break formation." The German fighters expected the Americans to scatter, to choose between protecting themselves or protecting the bombers. The Red Tails did neither. They tightened their formation, increased speed, and flew directly into the diving attack, forcing the Germans to commit to a head-on engagement at closing speeds above 600 miles per hour. It was suicide tactics. It was also brilliant. 2 German fighters collided, trying to avoid the wall of Mustangs. A third took rounds from McDaniel's .50 calibers and exploded. The rest scattered. The bombers reached Berlin, dropped their payload, and returned home. Not a single B-17 was lost. When the formation landed back at Ramitelli, the bomber crews came to the fighter pilots' barracks, an unprecedented breach of the informal segregation on base. A white captain from Minnesota named Thomas Bradshaw shook McDaniel's hand. "You crazy sons of bitches," he said, his voice thick. "You saved all of us today." McDaniel nodded. "That's the job." "No," Bradshaw insisted. "That's beyond the job. My crew, we've flown 30 missions. We've had escorts before. Nobody flies like you. Nobody protects us like you do." He paused, struggling for words. "Some of the guys, we were told things about Negro pilots, that you'd panic, that you'd run. I'm ashamed I believed any of it. You're the best damn pilots in this war." After he left, Williams turned to McDaniel. "Think that changes anything back home?" McDaniel shrugged. "Probably not, but it's a start." Yet even as respect grew among the combat crews, the knife in the dark kept finding targets. 3 more Red Tail pilots were killed in POW camps under suspicious circumstances between March and May 1944. Each time the official explanation changed, partisans' friendly fire accidents, escape attempts. Each time the truth was obvious to anyone paying attention. Hitler, meanwhile, had retreated further into delusion. At a briefing in late April, he raged at his military staff about the Negro problem. "How is this possible?" he demanded. "Göring, you assured me the Luftwaffe was superior to all Allied air forces." "Mein Führer, the Americans have more planes, more fuel. I'm not talking about numbers, I'm talking about race. These are supposed to be inferior beings, subhuman, and they're outflying German aces." No one wanted to answer. Finally, Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, spoke carefully. "Perhaps, mein Führer, our theories about race require refinement. If the empirical evidence suggests..." Hitler's glare silenced him. "The theory is correct. The evidence is anomalous. We simply haven't eliminated enough of them yet." The room went cold. In the months that followed, the Red Tails flew 179 bomber escort missions. They maintained their perfect record, no bomber lost to enemy fighters on their watch. They shot down over 100 German aircraft. They earned 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 14 Bronze Stars, and 744 air medals. And they did it while knowing that every time they took off, they might be sabotaged by their own side. Every time they were shot down, they might be executed by the enemy. Every time they succeeded, they made themselves bigger targets for both. Captain Williams, sitting in his quarters on the night of May 29th, wrote a letter to his mother that captured the impossible position they were in. "We're fighting for a country that doesn't want us. We're protecting men who won't eat with us. We're proving ourselves to people who will never admit we proved anything. But Mama, we keep flying. Because if we don't, if we quit, they'll say we were never good enough in the first place. So, we fly. And we survive. And we hope that someday someone will care that we did." But even in exhaustion and anger, even in betrayal and bloodshed, even in the knowledge that they were being used as pawns in games they couldn't control, the Red Tails never broke formation. They protected their bombers. They protected each other. And in doing so, they protected something more fragile and more powerful than any of them fully understood the possibility that human worth might actually have nothing to do with the color of human skin. That knowledge turned their fear into something harder, something colder, resolve forged in betrayal. June 9, 1944. Captain Wendell Pruitt sat in the briefing room at Ramitelli, while a white intelligence officer pointed at a map of Germany with a wooden pointer. The mission was Munich deep penetration, maximum enemy response expected. As the briefing ended, the officer added almost casually, "And gentlemen, if you're shot down over Bavaria, surrender only to Wehrmacht regular forces. Avoid the SS at all costs." After he left, the Red Tails sat in silence. Finally, Lieutenant Roscoe Brown spoke up. He just admitted it. They know the SS is executing Negro pilots, and they're telling us to choose our captors carefully. Pruitt stood. They're telling us we're on our own. They can't protect us, won't protect us, but they still need us to fly. So what do we do? Someone asked. We make it so they can't shoot us down. Pruitt's voice was flat absolute. We fly so well that we don't give them the chance. It should have been impossible. The human body has limits: reaction time, stamina, the ability to sustain G-forces. But the Red Tails were operating beyond those limits because they understood something their white counterparts didn't. For them, every mission was survival. Not just survival of the war, but survival of the idea that they deserved to exist in this sky at all. Over Munich that afternoon, Pruitt's wingman, Lieutenant Lee Archer, faced down 4 FW-190s alone when his flight got separated in cloud cover. The after-action report describes what happened with bureaucratic detachment. Lieutenant Archer engaged multiple enemy aircraft, destroying 2 confirmed, 1 probable. Despite being outnumbered, he maintained position until rejoining formation. What it doesn't mention is that Archer flew for 11 minutes with his fuel gauge showing empty. His engine coughing, his controls sluggish from damage, refusing to abandon the bombers he was protecting. When he finally landed back at Ramitelli on fumes and prayer, his crew chief found 37 bullet holes in his Mustang. "You should be dead," Sergeant Johnson said, running his hands over the damaged fuselage. Archer climbed out his flight suit, soaked with sweat. "Can't be dead, Sarge. Too many people want to see me fail." But in Berlin, failure was no longer an option the Reich leadership was willing to accept. On June 15th, Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer of the SS, attended a private meeting with Hitler in the Berghof. The topic was the Negro fighter problem, now classified under the euphemistic designation Sonderbehandlung, special treatment, the same term used for mass executions in the camps. The Americans are using these pilots as propaganda. Himmler explained, his voice as bland as if discussing crop yields. Every mission they complete successfully undermines our racial doctrines. The neutral nations are watching. Our own people are beginning to ask questions. Hitler stared out the window toward the Alps. Questions about what? About whether we've been accurate in our assessment of racial capabilities. The silence stretched 30 seconds. "I want this problem eliminated," Hitler finally said. "I don't care how. Mechanical failure, accidents, capture, and interrogation that ends badly, I don't care. But I want the American Negro fighter program destroyed before it destroys us." "That may be difficult, mein Führer. They're extraordinarily careful." "Then make them careless." Hitler spun around, his voice rising. "Offer rewards for their capture. Put bounties on their aircraft. Make every Luftwaffe pilot understand that shooting down a Red Tail is worth double any other kill. And if we capture them alive, I want them questioned, broken, and disappeared. Let the Americans wonder what happened to their angels." Himmler nodded. "It will be done." The Reich Propaganda Ministry began a quiet campaign that summer, never mentioning race directly, but referring mysteriously to special American units that were particularly dangerous to the security of the Reich. Luftwaffe pilots started receiving bonuses for confirmed kills of red-tailed aircraft. POW camps received coded instructions regarding non-standard prisoners who required alternative processing. The killing became systematic. Lieutenant Harold Brown was shot down over Romania on July 12th. His parachute was seen deploying. German ground forces reported capturing him alive. He was never seen again. No death certificate, no POW notification, no Red Cross confirmation. He simply ceased to exist in official records. 3 days later, Captain Edward Gleed's flight was ambushed by 8 Bf-109s over Austria. The Germans ignored the other 3 Mustangs and focused all their fire on Gleed's aircraft. He barely made it back to base his plane, so damaged it was scrapped. They knew, Gleed told Benjamin Davis that night. They specifically targeted my aircraft. Someone's telling them which planes have Negro pilots. Davis rubbed his face. He'd been awake for 31 hours straight. Could be the markings, could be intelligence leaks. Or it could be someone on our own side feeding them information. Davis wanted to dismiss it as paranoia, but 2 weeks later they found a white supply clerk photographing tail numbers and pilot assignments. He admitted under interrogation that he was selling information to a contact in neutral Portugal who was passing it to German intelligence. His punishment was a dishonorable discharge and 6 months in military prison. 6 months. For enabling the murders of American servicemen. They won't execute him because they'd have to explain what he did, Williams said bitterly. And they can't explain what he did without admitting we're being hunted specifically because we're Negroes. But even as the net closed tighter, the red tails kept flying. On July 18, 1944, they escorted bombers to Berlin for the 3rd time that month. Over Brandenburg, they encountered the largest German fighter formation any of them had seen, over 30 aircraft diving from altitude in coordinated waves. Captain Joseph Ellsbury was leading the escort that day. His radio transmission, preserved in mission records, became famous among the bomber crews. Red Tails close formation. We're going to show these boys how Americans fly. The dogfight lasted 18 minutes. When it ended, the Red Tails had shot down 11 German aircraft without losing a single plane. More importantly, all 64 bombers they were protecting made it home. The bomber group commander, a white colonel from Tennessee named Richard Davis, no relation to Benjamin, requested a meeting with the Red Tails afterward. He stood in front of the assembled pilots, many still in their sweat-stained flight gear, and struggled for words. "I was born in Memphis," he finally said. "I was raised to believe certain things about Negro people. That you were lazy, that you were cowards, that you were inferior." He paused, his voice breaking. "Every single day you prove those lies were poison I was fed my whole life. My crews are alive because of you. My men will see their children again because of you, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve the protection you gave us today." After he left, Lieutenant Brown turned to Pruitt. "Think it'll change anything?" "For him? Maybe. For the rest of the country." Pruitt shrugged. "We're not here to change minds, Roscoe. We're here to fly." But minds were changing slowly in ways neither side anticipated. Bomber crews began refusing to fly without Red Tail escorts. White pilots started defending the Red Tails in officers' clubs when others disparaged them. And in Germany, Luftwaffe pilots were developing a cautious, horrified respect for the men in the red-tailed Mustangs. A captured German pilot, Oberleutnant Hans Schumann, was interrogated by American intelligence in August 1944. The transcript is remarkable. "What can you tell us about the Negro fighter pilots?" "They are the best we face. Better than the British. Better than your white American squadrons." "Why do you think that is?" Long pause. "Because they fly like men who cannot afford to lose. Every maneuver is perfect. Every formation is tight. They protect each other like brothers. And they never ever abandon the bombers. We were told they would be easy victories. We were lied to." "What else were you told about them?" Another pause. "We were told they were subhuman, that they lacked courage and intelligence. But I have flown against them 4 times. I have watched them fight, and I know propaganda when I see it. The lies are not on your side." That interrogation report was classified confidential and buried in Pentagon files. The American command structure wasn't ready to admit that German prisoners were more forthright about racial equality than the U.S. military itself. Meanwhile, the SS was escalating. On August 3rd, Ramitelli Air Base received mortar fire at 0200 hours, the first direct attack on the facility. The shells hit the barracks area, killing 3 mechanics and wounding 7 others. An investigation found that the mortars were German army issue, but the attack had been carried out by Italian fascist partisans who'd been specifically paid to target the Negro section of the base. Security was tripled. The Red Tails started sleeping in shifts, never leaving their aircraft unguarded. They were fighting a war on 3 fronts now, the Luftwaffe in the sky, saboteurs on the ground, and discrimination within their own command. Benjamin Davis, promoted to lieutenant colonel, wrote a classified memo to the War Department in September 1944. The document, declassified in 1978, is devastating. The Negro pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group have completed 200 bomber escort missions without losing a single aircraft to enemy fighters, a record unmatched by any other unit in the theater. They have done this while facing sabotage, inadequate support, systematic targeting by enemy forces, and hostile conditions within the U.S. Army Air Forces itself. They have proven beyond any rational doubt their competence, courage, and commitment. Yet they continue to be segregated, discriminated against, and denied recognition commensurate with their achievements. This is not merely unjust. It is a waste of American military capability at a time when we can least afford such waste. I respectfully request that the War Department acknowledge what every bomber crew in the 8th Air Force already knows: these men are among the finest combat pilots in the world. The War Department's response, issued 2 weeks later, was a single paragraph thanking him for his service and noting that current policy regarding racial integration remains under review. Translation: nothing would change. On October 6th, Captain Armour McDaniel was shot down over Czechoslovakia during a strafing run. His wingman saw his parachute deploy and watched him land in a field. German troops were moving toward him. McDaniel was on his feet, hands raised. What happened next was witnessed by Czech resistance fighters hiding nearby. They reported it to Allied intelligence 3 months later after they'd escaped to British lines. The transcript marked "Top Secret" reads, "The American Negro pilot surrendered peacefully. Wehrmacht soldiers approached him. Then SS officers arrived in a separate vehicle. They argued with the Wehrmacht soldiers for several minutes. The Wehrmacht soldiers left. The SS officers took the American pilot behind a barn. We heard a single gunshot. The SS officers returned alone. They did not take a prisoner." McDaniel's family received a telegram stating he was missing in action. They never learned how he died. The Czech witness's testimony was suppressed until 1983. But the Red Tails knew. They always knew. Every missing pilot, every unexplained death, every casualty report that didn't quite add up, they understood they were facing an enemy that feared what they represented more than any bomb or bullet. And still they flew. By November 1944, they'd flown 311 missions. They'd shot down 112 enemy aircraft. They'd maintained their perfect record, no bomber lost to enemy fighters under Red Tail escort. They'd done this while losing 66 of their own pilots to combat accidents and what official reports called special circumstances. Hitler's empire was collapsing. The Allies were advancing on all fronts, but the Führer hiding in his bunker remained obsessed with the Red Tails. In his final months as Berlin burned and the Reich disintegrated, he continued to rage about the Negro pilots who had proven his life's work was built on lies. The Red Tails had won more than a military victory. They'd won something Hitler couldn't survive. They'd proven that human excellence has nothing to do with the color of human skin. And in a regime built entirely on racial mythology, that truth was more destructive than any bomb they could have dropped. Incels meant to cage the human spirit courage still found ways to fly. That truth carried them through the winter of 1944, when the war entered its final, most desperate phase. December 17, 1944. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Davis received orders that made his blood run cold. The 332nd was being reassigned to support Operation Bodenplatte, a massive Allied air campaign designed to destroy the Luftwaffe's remaining fighter capacity. Intelligence indicated the Germans were preparing a final suicidal defense of the Reich. Every available aircraft would be thrown into the sky. "They're asking us to fly into a meat grinder," Captain Williams said, reading the operational brief. Davis nodded slowly. "They're asking us because we're the only ones who can pull it off. Every other fighter group has lost bombers. We haven't. So when it gets desperate, when it gets impossible, they send us. Should we feel honored or insulted? Both." Davis stood his chair scraping against the floor. "Get the men ready. We fly at dawn." But that night something happened that would change everything. A young white lieutenant from Ohio named Timothy Walsh walked into the Red Tails officer's tent. He wasn't supposed to be there. The unofficial segregation on base meant white and black officers didn't mix socially. Everyone looked up, waiting. Walsh's voice shook. "I fly bombers. B-17s. I've done 43 missions." He paused, struggling. "Tomorrow's my 44th. My last mission before I rotate home." No one spoke. "I requested you specifically, the Red Tails, for my last mission." Walsh's eyes were wet. "Because I want to see my wife again. I want to meet my daughter. She was born while I was over here, and the only way I trust that happening is if you're flying above me." Williams stood. "We'll get you home, Lieutenant." Walsh nodded, started to leave, then turned back. "My father's a congressman from Ohio. He voted against the Tuskegee program, called it a waste of taxpayer money." His voice broke completely. "I'm going to tell him he was wrong. I'm going to tell him he owes you his grandchild's father." After he left the tent, remained silent for a long moment. Finally, Lieutenant Roscoe Brown spoke. "Think his father will listen?" "Probably not," Davis said, "but the son will remember. And maybe that's how change happens, one converted heart at a time." December 18th dawned gray and bitter cold. The mission briefing indicated 147 B-17s and B-24s would strike oil refineries in Silesia deep in German territory. Intelligence estimated 200 German fighters would respond. The odds were worse than bad. Captain Robert Williams stood beside his Mustang, watching the ground crew load ammunition. Sergeant Johnson handed him a thermos of coffee. "Sarge, if I don't make it back." "Don't." Johnson's voice was firm. "Don't you dare. You've got too many people counting on you to start thinking like that." Williams smiled thinly. "Just being realistic." "Realistic?" Johnson stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You want realistic. Every mission you fly, you're not just fighting Germans. You're fighting everyone who said you couldn't. Everyone who said we couldn't. You die up there and they'll say we failed. They'll say the experiment didn't work. They'll use your death to justify keeping every black kid in America out of the cockpit forever." He gripped Williams' shoulder. "So you don't get to die, Captain. None of you do. Because you're carrying all of us with you." The weight of that settled on Williams like a physical thing. He nodded slowly. "No pressure then. All the pressure in the world. Now get up there and show them what we're made of." The formation assembled over Italy at 08:15 hours. Walsh's bomber named Ohio Sunrise was in the third wave. As the Red Tails took their positions, Williams could see the bomber crews in their waist gun positions watching the Red Tails pull into protective formation. Some of them waved. The flight to Silesia took 2 hours and 37 minutes. The temperature at altitude was minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Ice formed on windscreens, gun mechanisms froze. Pilots flew with their hands growing numb inside heated gloves. They hit German airspace at 10:47 hours. The radio crackled. "Bandits 11 o'clock high, multiple groups." Lieutenant Lee Archer, flying lead that day, counted them. 40 fighters in the first wave, maybe 60 more behind them. The Germans weren't trying to be subtle. This was overwhelming force designed to break through any defense. Red tails maintain position, Archer ordered. Let them come to us. It violated every fighter pilot instinct to wait to let the enemy control the engagement. But the Red Tails had learned that protecting the bombers meant rewriting the rules of air combat. They didn't hunt, they defended. The first wave of German fighters, FW-190s and Bf-109s, dove from 28,000 feet, screaming down at 450 miles per hour. The Red Tails didn't break formation. They didn't scatter. They tightened up, increased speed, and flew directly into the diving attack. The Germans expected targets. They got a wall of 50 caliber fire. 3 German planes exploded in the first 5 seconds. 2 more collided trying to evade. The rest pulled up confused, their attack disrupted before it began. Second wave incoming, someone called. This group was more organized, trying to split the formation, create gaps they could exploit to reach the bombers. Lieutenant Charles Bailey saw their tactic immediately. "They're going for the stragglers," he radioed. "Red 4 and 5 tighten up on those last 3 bombers." Captain Wendell Pruitt and his wingman dove to cover the trailing B-17s. 2 German fighters followed them, seeing an opportunity. It was the last mistake those pilots made. Pruitt rolled inverted, pulled through, and came up behind the lead fighter. His guns fired for 2 seconds. The German plane came apart. His wingman got the second one. But the cost was mounting. Lieutenant Harold Morris took cannon fire through his cockpit, his left arm shattered. He kept flying with his right hand, staying in formation, refusing to break off, even as blood soaked his flight suit. "Morris, you're hit," Archer called. "Break off, head for base." "Negative." Morris's voice was tight with pain. "Still got one good arm. Still got ammunition. I'm staying." For 38 minutes, the battle raged at 25,000 feet. The sky was full of tracers, smoke trails, burning aircraft falling earthward. The Red Tails flew like men possessed, never leaving their positions, never abandoning the bombers. When it finally ended, when the last German fighter turned away, the bomber formation was intact. All 147 aircraft reached their target, dropped their payloads, and turned for home. But the triumph was incomplete. 3 Red-tail Mustangs were missing. Lieutenant Morris barely made it back, landing with his hydraulics shot out, skidding off the runway in a shower of sparks. Medics pulled him from the cockpit unconscious from blood loss. Lieutenant Walsh's B-17, Ohio Sunrise, landed 20 minutes later. Walsh climbed down from his bomber, walked directly to where the Red Tails were being debriefed, and saluted. "Thank you," he said simply. Then louder, "Thank you for my life." That night, Walsh sat in the mess hall, the segregated mess hall, where he wasn't supposed to be, and shared a meal with the men who'd saved him. It was a small act of defiance, witnessed by dozens of other personnel, and it sparked something. Over the next week, more white air crews started eating with the Red Tails, started drinking with them, started treating them not as an experiment or a curiosity, but as brothers in arms. But in Berlin, the reaction was very different. Hitler, now spending most of his time in the Führerbunker, as Allied armies closed in from all sides, received the battle report with trembling hands. They escorted 147 bombers. We sent 200 fighters. And they didn't lose a single bomber. His voice was barely a whisper. "Correct, mein Führer." "These Negro pilots." He couldn't finish the sentence. His entire worldview, his life's philosophy, was disintegrating in real time. If the inferior races could outfight the Aryan supermen, what did that say about everything he'd built? Everything he'd believed? Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels, one of the few remaining true believers, tried to salvage something. "Mein Führer, perhaps we should consider that the Americans have simply allocated more resources." Resources. Hitler's laugh was bitter, broken. "You think this is about resources? This is about everything we told the German people being revealed as lies. We said the Aryans were superior. We said other races were subhuman. And now Negro pilots are proving us wrong in the one arena where superiority should be most visible in combat." He stood pacing the bunker's narrow confines. Do you know what this means? It means every Jew we murdered, every Slav we enslaved, every policy we based on racial hierarchy, it's all built on a foundation of falsehood. And if the German people realize that if they understand, we led them into this catastrophe based on lies. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. The implication was clear. The Red Tails weren't just winning a military conflict. They were demolishing the ideological structure of Nazism itself. On January 14, 1945, the 332nd flew what would become their most famous mission. 72 Red Tail Mustangs escorted bombers to strike industrial targets outside Berlin. Over Brandenburg, they encountered a formation of jet fighters, Me-262s, the most advanced aircraft in the world, 100 miles per hour faster than anything the Allies had. The jets should have massacred them. But the Red Tails had learned something crucial: speed isn't everything. Discipline, coordination, and absolute trust in your wingman could overcome technological superiority. When the jets attacked, the Red Tails didn't panic. They didn't scatter. They executed a maneuver they'd practiced but never used in combat, a defensive spiral that forced the jets into turning battles where their speed advantage became a liability. Lieutenant Charles Brantley got a firing solution on one jet and held his trigger for 3 full seconds. The Me-262 exploded spectacularly, the first jet aircraft ever shot down by the Red Tails, and one of the first jets destroyed by conventional fighters in the entire war. The bomber crews witnessed it, radioed it back to base, and by the time the formation landed, the story had spread through the entire theater. The Red Tails had killed a jet. But the victory was bittersweet. 2 Mustangs were lost in the engagement. Captain Joseph Ellsbury was seen going down over German territory. His status: missing in action. Ellsbury was actually alive, captured by Wehrmacht troops who treated him correctly under Geneva Convention rules. But SS officers arrived hours later demanding custody. The Wehrmacht captain refused. He's a prisoner of war, under my authority. He's a Negro, under special orders from Berlin. The Wehrmacht captain, a career officer named Klaus Müller, who would survive the war and testify at Nuremberg, made a decision that saved Ellsbury's life. I don't care what Berlin says, this man surrendered to Wehrmacht forces. He stays in Wehrmacht custody. The SS officers left. Ellsbury spent the remaining months of the war in a POW camp, treated no worse than any other prisoner. He never learned how close he came to summary execution. By March 1945, the Reich was in its death throes. Soviet forces were fighting in Berlin's suburbs. American and British armies were crossing the Rhine, and Hitler in his bunker was still obsessing over the Red Tails. His final mention of them, recorded by stenographer Gerhard Hergesell on April 22, 1945, 8 days before Hitler's suicide, is chilling. History will judge us not by whether we won or lost, but by whether we maintained our principles. And we failed. We failed because we allowed reality to contradict our truths. Those Negro pilots? They should not exist. But they do. And their existence means everything we believed was wrong. 9 days later, Hitler was dead. The Reich collapsed, and the Red Tails flew their final combat mission on April 30, 1945, the same day Hitler pulled the trigger in his bunker. They'd flown 1,578 combat missions. They'd destroyed 112 enemy aircraft in the air and another 150 on the ground. They'd escorted 15,000 bombers and lost only 27 to enemy fighters, a loss rate 1/10 that of other fighter groups. But the numbers don't tell the real story. The real story is that they'd done all of this while fighting enemies on both sides of the battle line, while being sabotaged, targeted, excluded, and denied, while knowing that every mistake would be used to condemn their entire race, and every success would be minimized or ignored. They'd won the war in the sky. But the war at home was just beginning. Freedom had arrived in Europe, carried on wings painted red. But it came with a bitter truth. The men who'd defended democracy abroad were still denied it at home. That knowledge followed them home, like a shadow they couldn't shake. May 8, 1945. VE Day. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Davis stood on the tarmac at Ramitelli, watching his pilots celebrate. They were spraying champagne, embracing crying with relief that they'd survived. But Davis couldn't join them. He was thinking about the 66 men who weren't there. The ones who'd been shot down, executed, disappeared. The ones whose families received telegrams instead of homecomings. Captain Robert Williams found him an hour later, sitting alone in the operations tent. "Colonel, the men are asking for you." Davis looked up, his eyes hollow. "What do I tell them, Robert?" "That we won. We did. We proved everything we set out to prove. We flew better than anyone said we could. We saved thousands of lives. We broke records that'll stand for decades." He paused. "And tomorrow, when we go home, we'll still have to sit in the back of the bus." Williams sat down heavily. "Then we tell them the war isn't over. It's just changing location." The journey back to the United States took 3 weeks. The 332nd Fighter Group boarded troop transports in Naples, crossed the Atlantic, and arrived in New York Harbor on June 4, 1945. They could see the Statue of Liberty from the deck. Some of the men wept. Others stood in silence, wondering what that statue's promise of freedom actually meant for them. Lieutenant Roscoe Brown noticed something as they approached the dock. "There's no crowd." He was right. Other units returning from Europe were greeted by ticker-tape parades, brass bands, thousands of cheering civilians. The Red Tails docked at a nearly empty pier. A handful of black newspaper reporters were there, and some family members who'd traveled at their own expense. That was all. "We saved bombers from here to Berlin," Lieutenant Lee Archer said quietly. "We shot down jets. We never lost a man to enemy fighters on our watch, and we get this." "What did you expect?" Captain Wendell Pruitt's voice was flat. "We were useful when they needed us. Now we're just inconvenient evidence that everything they believe about us is wrong." They processed through Camp Kilmer in New Jersey, received their discharge papers and back pay, and then faced the reality of returning to civilian life in Jim Crow America. Lieutenant Charles Bailey was told he couldn't buy a house in the neighborhood where he'd grown up because a restrictive covenant barred Negroes and other undesirables. Captain Joseph Ellsbury, who'd survived being shot down and captured by the Germans, was refused service at a diner in Georgia. When he protested that he was a decorated war veteran, the owner told him, "I don't care if you're General MacArthur, we don't serve coloreds." Lieutenant Harold Morris, who'd flown with a shattered arm to protect his bombers, applied for a commercial pilot's license. The examiner, a white man who'd never flown in combat, failed him on technical grounds that made no sense. "You people just don't have the temperament for commercial aviation," he explained. The cruelest irony came in late June when Lieutenant Timothy Walsh, the white bomber pilot who'd requested the Red Tails for his last mission, tracked down Robert Williams in Alabama. Walsh had kept his promise to tell his congressman father the truth about the Tuskegee Airmen. "He listened," Walsh said, his voice tight with anger. "He listened to everything I told him. About how you saved my life. About how you were the best pilots in the theater. About how you deserved recognition and respect." He paused. "Then he told me I'd been deceived by wartime propaganda. He said the Negro pilots were given easy missions and their success was exaggerated. He said I was too emotional to see things clearly." Williams nodded slowly. He'd expected this. "What did you say?" "I told him he was wrong. I told him I'd been there. I'd seen it with my own eyes. I told him he was a coward and a liar." Walsh's voice broke. "He disinherited me. Cut me off completely, said I'd betrayed my race and my class." "I'm sorry," Williams said, and meant it. "Don't be. I'd rather be broke and honest than rich and complicit." Walsh extended his hand. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life telling people the truth about what you did, even if nobody wants to hear it." They shook hands. It was a small gesture, but it mattered, because the battle for recognition, for basic acknowledgement of what the Red Tails had accomplished, was going to be long and bitter. Benjamin Davis, now a full colonel, testified before Congress in August 1945. The hearing was supposed to address the future of Negro personnel in the armed forces. Davis sat at a table facing a committee of white congressmen, most of whom had opposed the Tuskegee program from the beginning. Colonel Davis, one congressman from Mississippi, began, his voice dripping with false courtesy. Can you explain to this committee why the Negro fighter pilots should be retained in a peacetime military given the documented difficulties of integration? Davis looked at him for a long moment. Congressman, the only documented difficulties were created by people who didn't want us to succeed. We flew 15,000 bomber escort missions. We lost 27 bombers to enemy fighters, a loss rate of 0.18%. The average loss rate for other fighter groups was 2.5%. That's not a typo. We were 14 times more effective at protecting bombers than our white counterparts. Those numbers are disputed. They're not disputed. They're verified by every bomber group we escorted. They're in every after-action report. They're in captured German documents, where Luftwaffe pilots described us as the most dangerous fighters they faced. Davis's voice remained calm, but his eyes were steel. The only people disputing these numbers are the ones who can't accept what they mean. And what do they mean, Colonel? They mean everything you believe about racial inferiority is a lie. They mean you wasted American talent and American lives by excluding Negroes from combat roles for generations. They mean this country owes a debt to the men who fought for it, despite being denied the freedoms they were defending. The hearing room went silent. Finally, the committee chairman cleared his throat. Thank you for your testimony, Colonel. We'll take your comments under advisement. The military integrated 5 years later in 1950, but not because of gratitude or justice. It integrated because the Korean War created a manpower shortage that made discrimination impractical. Even then, many of the Tuskegee Airmen were passed over for promotion, denied advanced training, and quietly forced out of the service. But something else was happening. Something slower, but more profound. The men who'd flown with the Red Tails, the bomber crews they'd protected, were going home and telling their own stories. At VFW halls and American Legion posts in bars and living rooms, white veterans were explaining to their families and friends that everything they'd been taught about Negro inferiority was wrong. Timothy Walsh became a history teacher in Ohio. He dedicated 1 week every year to teaching about the Tuskegee Airmen. His school board tried to stop him. "This isn't appropriate curriculum," they said. "You're pushing a political agenda." "I'm teaching history," Walsh replied. "And if history makes you uncomfortable, that says more about you than about the history." He was fired in 1948, but continued teaching independently, hosting lectures in his home for anyone who wanted to learn the truth. By the time he died in 1987, he'd taught over 10,000 people about the Red Tails. The real recognition began in the 1970s, when civil rights advances made it possible to finally tell the full story. A historian named Charles Francis started researching the 332nd Fighter Group, interviewing surviving pilots and cross-referencing their accounts with military records. What he discovered shocked him. "They didn't just succeed," Francis said in a 1975 interview. "They succeeded while being systematically undermined by their own military. They succeeded while being targeted for assassination by the enemy. They succeeded while knowing that every mistake would be used to condemn their entire race. The mental fortitude required to operate under those conditions. I'm not sure I can even comprehend it." In 1995, a researcher going through declassified SS documents at the National Archives discovered the smoking gun-coded messages explicitly ordering the execution of captured Negro American pilots and offering bounties for their aircraft. The documents proved what the Red Tails had always known: they were being hunted not just as enemy combatants, but as racial targets. Robert Williams, then 74 years old, was interviewed about the revelation. "We knew," he said simply. "Every man who flew with us knew. We just couldn't prove it. And the people who could have proven it didn't want to." "Does it anger you," the interviewer asked, "that it took 50 years for the truth to come out? Williams was quiet for a long time. Anger doesn't serve the dead. What serves them is remembering. What serves them is making sure this country never forgets what happened when young men loved their country more than their country loved them. On March 29, 2007, President George W. Bush awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the Tuskegee Airmen. The ceremony was held in the Capitol Rotunda. Of the 996 pilots who'd served with the program, fewer than 300 were still alive. They came in wheelchairs and with canes, wearing their old uniforms that no longer fit quite right, their red caps marking them as members of an exclusive brotherhood. Benjamin Davis, Jr., then 94 years old, spoke briefly. His voice was thin but steady. "We didn't fight for recognition. We didn't fight for medals. We fought because our country needed us, even though our country didn't want us. We fought to prove that excellence has no color. And we fought so that the young people coming after us wouldn't have to face the barriers we faced." He paused, looking at the young black and brown faces in the audience, children and grandchildren of a generation that had benefited from battles they'd never witnessed. The war we fought wasn't just against Germany. It was against the idea that human worth can be measured by the color of human skin. We won that war in the sky. But the victory only means something if each generation continues to reject that poisonous idea. Lieutenant Lee Archer, one of the last surviving aces, was asked in 2008 what he wanted people to remember about the Red Tails. He was 89 years old, his hands trembling with age, but his mind was sharp. "Remember that we loved flying more than we hated discrimination," he said. "Remember that we protected men who didn't think we were fully human. Remember that we did it with discipline, with excellence, with a commitment to our mission that never wavered." He leaned forward. "But most importantly, remember that we shouldn't have had to prove anything. We shouldn't have had to be exceptional to be treated as equal. And if you remember that, then maybe the next generation won't have to prove themselves the way we did." The memorials came slowly. A statue at the Air Force Academy in 2009. A red-tailed P-51 Mustang permanently displayed at the Smithsonian. A documentary that told their story to millions. But perhaps the most powerful memorial was unofficial. A tradition started by bomber crews and passed down through generations of pilots. At flight schools across America, when student pilots complete their first solo flight, many instructors present them with a red tail patch, a symbol of excellence protection, and the understanding that flying is a privilege earned through skill, not granted by birthright. Captain Marcus Johnson, the crew chief who'd maintained those red-tailed Mustangs at Ramitelli, died in 2011 at age 93. His funeral was attended by pilots from every branch of service, black and white, young and old. They came because he had kept those planes flying under impossible conditions. They came because he'd understood that every rivet, every weld, every perfectly calibrated engine was part of a larger fight. In his eulogy, his grandson read from a letter Johnson had written in 1944. "I work on these planes like my own life depends on them, because it does. Not because I'm in danger, I'm safe on the ground. But because if these pilots fail, if they crash because I missed something, then every black mechanic, every black pilot, every black person in America loses. So I check every bolt twice. I test every system 3 times. And I pray over every plane before it takes off. Because we're not just fighting a war. We're fighting for the right to be seen as human." The last surviving Tuskegee Airman will likely die in the next few years. Their story will pass from living memory into history. But their legacy isn't just in the missions they flew or the enemies they defeated. It's in the simple revolutionary truth they proved with their lives that courage, skill, and honor have no color. That excellence can emerge from anywhere. That a nation that excludes based on prejudice isn't just morally wrong, it's wasting its own strength. Hitler built an empire on the lie that some humans are inherently superior to others. The Red Tails destroyed that lie not with speeches or theories, but with action. Every mission they flew, every bomber they protected, every enemy they defeated was evidence that the foundation of Nazi ideology was rotten. In the end, the Führer who'd dreamed of a 1,000-year Reich died in a bunker, destroyed as much by his own delusions as by Allied armies. The inferior pilots he'd tried to eliminate lived to see their children and grandchildren fly without restrictions, serve without limitations, achieve without artificial barriers. They were told they couldn't fly. They flew better than anyone. They were told they were inferior. They proved superiority is earned, not inherited. They were told they should accept their place. They redefined what that place could be. The Red Tails didn't just win a war. They won something more important. They won the right to be judged by what they did rather than what they looked like. And in doing so, they made America slightly more honest about its own promises. If you believe their names deserve to be remembered, share this story. And in the comments below, write the name of just one Tuskegee Airman. Let them be remembered not as a collective, but as individuals who chose courage over comfort, excellence over excuses, and service over self-preservation. They flew into history with red tails and unbreakable spirits. Let them be remembered that way forever.